calls our presence back into the room after wandering in those beautiful chords of music. Thank you so much. The reading this morning was perfect, wasn't it? Especially for the druid in each and every one of us. I'm not too surprised that a number of people are interested in this topic because there's virtually nothing known about it. So if you don't think you know anything about the druids, you are not alone. What we have is a word that is pieced together from two or three cognates in the Celtic tradition. Dru and Vid. And Dru has to do with the knowing, the deep inner knowing. And Vid has to do with the life that is symbolized in the oak tree, the tree of life. Many of us have seen that image where there's this great branching tree with this solid trunk, and then below it is the root system.
It's right in front of us.
We have the great tree with the solid trunk. Indeed we do. So the Druid, that have become known as the Druids, were the priestly caste of a very intensely caste system, which is not too surprising because it was created by the very same people who created the caste system in India. Okay. What we see as we look across European and Asian history is about every 200 years there's an expansion out of the set of mountains called the Caucasus, hence so many Caucasians in the room. And the people who came out of the Caucasus had a very firm belief in a hierarchical structure with the strong man at the top and the weakest children, women, and elderly at the bottom. And they also had a very firm belief that the lighter the skin, the brighter the hair, the clearer, the lighter the eyes, the more close to God one actually was. And so the darker the skin, the more close to earth and the less to be appreciated. And sadly, that concept has swept over the earth and was present in the parts of the world that we call the Gaelic or Celtic parts of the world today, long before the Roman Empire arrived. And you can actually trace it on the maps of history. You can see, every 200 years there's a shift, there's a ripple across Asia and Europe, and another ripple. And it is marked by invasions and by takeovers and by migrations. So what we see is the Fertile Crescent area there in the middle of all of things beginning to break apart into city-states, and the people beginning to move further and further away from that. The ones who are maintaining their village life, the ones who are staying connected to the earth instead of pledging allegiance to an emperor. And that happens until the very west coast. In fact, an island off the west coast of Ireland that the British pulled everybody off of in 1952 in the very last act of empire building. And so what we have is a caste system that says if you're small and dark, you're at the bottom, and if you're big and blonde, you're at the top. And the people at the top are royalty, and the people in the middle have different layers of castes, classes, if you will. And the very top is the royalty. In India, we call that the Raja group, the Rani group, Rajas and Ranis. And then the next group is the priestly group, the Brahmins in India. And sometimes they're referred to that in other parts of Europe. And then the warrior class, and then the merchant class, and then the landholding farmer class, which is above the tenant farmer or serf, which is above the laborer, which is above, in India, the untouchables. And in the Celtic regions, the fairies. The smallest, darkest people in the Celtic tradition are the people we know as the fairies. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. So some of you may recall in the story of King Arthur, that great big blonde man who was married to that lovely, tall, slender, blonde Guinevere. But before he married her, a fairy bewitched him and seduced him, a small, dark woman who was of the traditional culture. And she had a son by him. And so the rest of his life is this tension, balancing tension between his draw to that caste and class in which he was born, into which he was born, and this child and this relationship that was formed when he was a teenager, almost against his will. And that really is the tension of all of the British Isles that is maintained until today. Now, the first record we have of people that we are now calling Druids and that have been translated from the Greek is about 300 BC, which is, that Plato, Socrates, Aristotle period, a little after, around Alexander in that whole time period when Greece was moving from nation states into an empire of its own. And there is a reference to great philosophical schools around the world, which includes Hindus, Buddhists, and the Druids of the far northwest. Isn't that interesting? As far back as Alexander, they're aware of these people. And it also includes the remaining teachers and priests of the Egyptian temples and pyramids. So what has emerged over the last, particularly 50 years, but was present about 150, 200 years ago in European and American folklore traditions or mystery traditions, is the idea that all of those great philosophical schools were linked. And they were linked in something that has come to be known, thanks to the Theosophists, as the Great White Brotherhood. And in fact, there is a strong tradition that period between age 12 and age 30 that Jesus of Nazareth is not talked about was spent moving from one place to another of the schools of the Great White Brotherhood. And that man who supplied the tomb into which the body was placed on Good Friday, Joseph of Arimathea, was in fact a tin merchant who traveled to England to get his tin, and was an uncle of Jesus, and was responsible for Jesus' training into the Great White Brotherhood, and took him there during his adolescence to study with the Druids. And that tradition not only comes through the Theosophists and a wonderful book called The Nine Faces of Christ by Whitworth, marvelous book, but that tradition actually grows out of the folklore of the Irish, which I think is marvelous, because Celtic Christianity is unlike any other Christianity in the world. Totally unlike it, because what they were able to do is cut themselves off from Rome. This is the great gift St. Patrick gave Ireland. He said, I'm good enough, we don't need to play with the Papa. I've made the bridge, it's okay, they'll go along with whatever I say. And so he allowed them to maintain some of those fundamental teachings of this great philosophical school and adopt and adapt Christianity to fit that instead of what happened everywhere else in Europe, where it was that Christianity, the Roman Church, adopted and adapted local stuff. Okay? So in Ireland, we have a Druidic Christianity, if you will. And we see the Celtic cross. It's different from the Roman cross, right? And we see a tradition of aliveness and nature woven into the Christian tradition that isn't present in the Roman. The Roman is based on a Greek social and cultural idea. And the Celtic, the Irish Christian, is based on the Druidic social and cultural and natural philosophy. So the Druids that Caesar met about 30 BC and talks about in that famous book that begins Veni Vidi Vici You know, he talks about these amazing people who, the way he talks about them, he sees them as fitting the senatorial class of Rome. Now, most of us don't know that the senatorial class or caste in the Roman tradition were not just the guys who stood in the forum and made the laws and debated and ultimately killed Julius, who became Caesar, but they were also the priests. Only they could be priests. So Caesar described, Julius, before he was Caesar, when he was still a general, described these guys that he met who were very sophisticated, very knowledgeable, very wise, and very comfortable in their power as very much like the senators in Rome, so that the people in Rome could understand, basically. But there are a lot of people who say, nah. He was, you know, looking through his own mental framework, and that's not who they actually were. The next indication that we have of these people is the next general after Julius. Because if you recall the history of Rome, once Julius Caesar got as far as Chartres, where he met the Druid people, and it is that rock on which Chartres Cathedral stands, where he met them, the Roman Empire had its own manifest destiny and continued to expand northward all the way up as far as Hadrian's Wall because they couldn't defeat the Celtic Scots. You know? And the reason they couldn't is because the Celtic Scots already had a firm hold on their own power. And they couldn't defeat the Irish because Irish were on their own island and they held that island. So as far as Rome could go was what we call Britain today. That was it. The Celts held them back. Now, Celt is an interesting word. Most of us first encountered it in the word kilt. Because most of the Roman soldiers were Celts, wearing kilts. In case you've always wondered, why do those centurions wear skirts? It's because they were Celtic soldiers. They were the warrior caste of the Celtic tradition. And because they knew the Roman way of war, they could defeat it. So there were Celts going back and forth between being in the army and being against the armies. It was a very interesting time, I'm sure. So what we can see, if we allow ourselves, is this wave process every couple hundred years, and this one group of people kind of leading that edge. They're Caucasians, and they take over one group, and then they intermarry, and they accept some of the values, but they keep some of their other values. And over 200 years, that pressure from the empires pushes them out further, and pushes them out further, and pushes them out further, until ultimately Scotland, Wales, Ireland, that's it. That's as far as you can go. Unless you go to Greenland. But the Norsemen are there. Mm-hmm. That's a bit of a battle. But Iceland, that's where they ended up. So we get this, and every 200 years there's this shift, these ripples, and the basic structure moves further west, but then it gets interwoven with what was there. And so it loses a little bit of its original way of being. Does that make sense? Yeah. Well, that cycle pretty much ended for that group of Caucasians along about 1200 AD, which is about the time that we say King Arthur was around, at least according to the written stories. The oral stories put him back about 500 years before that, but the written stories. And it's about the time when the Roman Empire Church consolidated itself in Europe. And so we're seeing a stabilization at that point as far as the Celtic and the local small dark people are. And we begin to see a settling in. And we begin to see a shift from we are taking this and taking over to we are here and planting ourselves. So in that period, let's say between about 1000 AD and 1200 AD, I still use that old terminology. The new one is CE, Common Era. Anyway, in that period, we have the settling in and the holding on. Okay, we've fought off the Romans, we've held them back. There's no place to go. This is it. And so there is a shift from a focus on cattle and herding to a focus on farming. And now there is a shift from being, as manly as possible out in the world to shifting the energy into what has been held by that one caste of people, the priestly class, the druidic class. And so what those guys had done, and it was virtually all guys up until about 1200, all men, what they had done is created a system of memorized songs and stories and statements about the nature of things that took about 20 years to learn. A boy would enter who had been asking the right questions. Those of you who went to the mystery school thing, you have to start by asking questions. If a kid doesn't ask questions, they're not invited. It's their questions that pull them in. And once they start to ask the questions, they're given opportunities to learn, and they begin to memorize what they have been taught. They memorize chants. They memorize stories, word for word, tone for tone, syllable for syllable, exactly the way they heard it. And when they can do that with everything they've heard so far, then they are introduced to new material. So by the time they are 27, they know the whole body of material. In the presence of the church, that began to be a bit of an issue. Because the church insisted that the only material that you learn was what the Roman Church said you should learn. The daily Mass, basically. That's all you were supposed to learn. Nobody read the Bible. Yeah, so the daily Mass was what we were supposed to know, and a few stories about Jesus and the saints. And so what happened was, as the Roman Church succeeded where the Roman Empire had failed, that is, incurring into the area, the Druidic priestly caste, some of them went into the priesthood. We get Celtic Christianity. And some of them became bards. Bards. And if you lived in Ireland today, every year as you were growing up, you would go to summer camp in Dingle. Dingle is the far west coast of Ireland. It is the least British part of Ireland, and you would be speaking Irish. You'd be speaking Irish Celtic language, and you'd be learning the songs. Syllable by syllable, word by word, tone by tone, exactly as you were taught it. Because that is the way the Druidic philosophy is carried forward in the songs and in the stories. And that's how you do it underground. In Europe, it was the troubadours. The Gnostics went underground and became troubadours. In Ireland and Scotland, they went underground and became bards, storytellers, pub singers. Ceremony all but disappeared until about 150 years ago. And for some reason, and we can go into it if you choose, but probably not now, the whole area, the whole attitude in the mid-1800s throughout Europe and the Americas went through a shift. I think it has to do with the fact that in 1848 we had the last revolution from a monarchy to a democratic republic. And once you have a democratic republic, you have individual opinions. What a strange notion. Individual opinions allow for individual expression. Oh my goodness. Well, if I can have individual expression, then I have this song and this story and these tales my grandfather and great-grandfather told the family over and over again, and grandmother held these things, these objects, these bowls and these brooms and these stones, and they're supposed to be related, and then you start listening to the stories and the songs, and you realize they're describing the objects the grandmother had held on to, and you realize you know what the ceremonies are. And so starting in the late 1800s and moving into the late 1900s, we see a renewal of sort of a neo-Druidism, if you will, a renewal of the ancient ways, much the same as was happening in the United States as the native people took back their ways. And it was a struggle everywhere in the world. It is still a struggle as native people take back their ways in the face of the empire culture that says, no, the only way to go is to have your cell phone and all these other things. You got to be able to buy things. You got to be able to do all of these things the way the empire does it, right? We can go back and we can reconnect with the incredibly rich philosophy that those Druid classes taught, the priests of that time taught. Now, how did it happen that they taught that? How did it happen that there was a priestly caste who had all this philosophical knowledge? Now, it may be that they were part of something that was worldwide, this great white brotherhood, and each region had its own variation. The Taoists, the Buddhists, the Hindus, the Egyptians, the Druids, and a few others. It may be that that is exactly what happened. And there is an interesting fact to pay attention to, and that is that all the great pyramids of the world are on one line that's at a 30-degree angle from the equator. One line around the world. And if, when we're to make that the equator, the North Pole is in an interesting position. There was apparently a 30-degree shift of the planet somewhere between about 10,000, where we think all those pyramids and stone circles and things probably were built, and when we have recorded history. There's every evidence that that's the case. So it may be that there was a global culture that understood that this planet is part of a dance with the other planets and the sun, and that understood that life is a principle that will take whatever form is allowed it to take in a particular environment, and that once that life has taken hold, it is worthy of our honor, our appreciation, our gratitude in the form it has taken in this place. It is nonetheless life. And then there is the understanding of the abstractions behind that. I love the word philosophy, lover of wisdom, love of wisdom. So for someone to say about 300 BC that there was this great philosophy, there were these philosophers, these lovers of wisdom in the far northlands, in the far northwest area, the Celtic lands, is to say that they saw that realization that there is an abstract wisdom in, through, and behind all concrete experience. Quantum physicists call that the intelligence of the quantum field, behind all form. And that consciousness brings forth form, and the shape of the consciousness brings forth a specific form, and that there may be, as David Bohm, the physicist, said, an implicate order out of which everything becomes explicate. Plato would agree. So if the writers of the time of Plato recognized that these people that we call Druids up there in the Scotland, Ireland, Wales, British, and actually well into France, as I say, Julius met the Druids at Chartres. That they recognized that these Celtic people had these philosophers means that they recognized the similarity of thinking. It was a different style because the Druids didn't have writing. St. Patrick actually introduced writing. And that's when we get the illuminated manuscripts. That's how the Druids who entered the priesthood maintained it. By writing into not only the Christian tradition, things that they had to copy, with all the illuminations of the dragons and the triple spiral and all those other things that have nothing to do with the New Testament or the Old Testament, right? But also to write the philosophy that was already present when Christianity was introduced. And that philosophy, that love of wisdom, is what was carried forward. And really, what I have told you is all we know about the Druids. We can infer a few things. One of them is there are some objects, okay? And one of them is the golden knife. And the golden knife is associated with mistletoe, which is another object. And it appears that in the winter, when the only thing that appears to be alive on a dormant tree is the mistletoe, the green, that becomes the symbol of this principle of life. And it appears that a ceremonial use of the golden knife to cut the mistletoe for the village, for the people, for now, that will be their healing herb for the rest of the year, is part of the Druidic tradition. And what that tells us is, as in most of the Caucasian empires, the priestly caste is also the healer caste. It's where most of the healing traditions are maintained. And that it's usually the women who are actually maintaining those traditions, and it's the men who talk about them and do the official acts. Okay. Another piece that we can infer from some of the things that we have seen is that that great tree, that tree of life, that is usually an oak tree. And one of the reasons it's an oak tree is because the oak tree hangs onto its leaves through the winter in most of Celtic land. They're dead. They are as brown and dry as they could be, but they don't fall off until the new leaf pushes them off. Now, isn't that a marvelous symbol? All right? That there is no death. There is only life in many forms. And that appears to be the only philosophical teaching that was recorded by anybody about the Druids in that period between 300 BC and the general who followed Julius into the Celtic lands. They understood there is no death. There is only life in many forms. And that when the body is given up, it is never dead. The being is never dead. The body becomes part of the earth in many new forms of life. And the being goes on to other forms of life, perhaps to return, which is part of why the Romans loved Celtic soldiers. They were not afraid of death. And it's also part of why most of the Knights Templar were in fact Celts. They did not fear death either. So there is a wonderful underlying, deep, deep understanding that the Druids stand for and taught and have managed somehow through story, through song, through continuing to offer a possibility to teach. Now, Many of you know that I was trained in a tradition called New Thought, and some of you also were trained in that tradition. And in that tradition, there is the same kind of openness that Unitarian Universalists have, the same kind of recognition that all paths are paths to the same experience. And one of my students was ordained in this tradition. Her primary teachers were religious science, and the building in which she was ordained, where I was the assistant at the time, was a Unity church. And she is of Irish extraction, and so she decided to go to Ireland, and she took some friends with her to Ireland the spring following her fall ordination. She was ordained in October, and this was March. And they arrive on a certain island off the west coast of Ireland that is known to have many shaman living on it. Now, shaman is one of those words that empire culture has labeled everybody with. Okay? Every indigenous culture has someone who understands and feels the balance that must be maintained, the harmony that must be maintained within the individual, within the community, and between the community and its environment. And there are many, many, many different ways to manage that, but that person is always called the shaman. Well, this particular island off the coast of Ireland is littered with, according to some sources, shaman. And it happened that she was there on the spring equinox, in some ways intentionally, but she didn't realize how intentionally. And there was a bonfire. And at all of these points of the year, the 8 points of the year, the Celts honor this. The equinoxes, the solstice, and the midpoints, and this last July 31st and August 1 was one of those midpoints. There is a bonfire. The bonfire is used to clean out what is now dirty from the last quarter and season, and to create a purification, okay, a purification. And then as that huge bonfire begins to dwindle down to be only 3 or 4 feet high, or maybe 2 feet high, it becomes a symbol of contracts and agreements for the future. And my friend, this New Thought minister, who's totally devoted to this, wonderful ideas that it is all one, and we are all one, and all these paths work to have us have that experience of one, is just fascinated. And she's glowing. And these 2 guys come up to her and said, "You are it." And they grab her and they pick her up and they lift her over the bonfire, and now they say, "And now you are one of us. You are their druidic priestess for your community." She goes, "What?" You gotta be kidding me. I'm a minister. I'm supposed to get up in front of people and talk about Jesus and Old Testament stuff, and now I'm what? Well, needless to say, she has continued to explore this path, and a year later she had a small triple spiral tattooed right here to remind her, I may be in the world of suburban America, but this is where my heart has always been. The triple spiral is the symbol of life emerging in all of its ways. In the goddess, we see it as the maiden, mother, and crone. In the God, we see it as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. In life, we see it as emergence, maturity, and decline. Spirals of life. So my friend continues to go to Ireland almost every year, and she often takes people there. And 2 of my other students went with her one year, and, well, it wasn't legal for them to get married in this country at that time, so they went and they jumped over a bonfire and became hand-fasted in Ireland. And they now are a married couple. And I'm very pleased for both of these wonderful women. They're very happy. So, hand-fasting, jumping over a bonfire, at least 5,000 years old, probably 50,000 years old, brought forward in the deep memories and the deep heart knowings of every being that allows themselves to resonate with that part of humanity that we